Okay, scholars, I'm back. Took a little break, stretched my legs a little bit. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we raise our children, child rearing patterns. Caring for children is a universal function of the family. All cultures and all societies expect parents to provide care for their children. However, the ways in which societies assign this function to family can differ from one culture to another. Today, we see that fewer than 1 in 5 children live in a household with a father present and working, a mother present, and no other step or custodial children present. So, what that's saying is that it's becoming increasingly uncommon for children to grow up with mom and dad and just their siblings in the household. That today, due to divorce and remarriage, more kids are growing up with step siblings and step parents in the family or with a single parent than in the past. So only about 20% of kids are fortunate enough to grow up. And in some cases, that's not always fortunate. If your parents are fighting constantly, that's not necessarily a good thing. As a matter of fact, some research has shown that if there's a lot of conflict in the family, the children are actually better off for the family to divorce. In spite of some of the economic hardships, they may be better off, not financially, but emotionally, as a result of the lack of conflict in the household after the divorce occurs. So let's talk about parenthood and grandparenthood. There are four factors that sociologists have identified as complicating the transition to adulthood. So when we think about growing into adulthood, there are some things that make it harder to grow into adulthood. For example, sociologists have said that there's little anticipatory socialization for the caregiver role. And what we mean by that is that we don't spend a whole lot of time preparing to become parents. We don't, there very few of us attend parenting classes, although they may be recommended and it might be advisable. And I can tell you that even though I was in my early 30s when my daughter was born, that it was still actually, I was a little older than that. When my daughter was born, I would have been in the mid 30s. So, even though hoped to be ready as a parent, there were challenges that I wasn't quite prepared for. So you can imagine the lack of preparation for someone who gets pregnant in high school or pregnant shortly after high school. There just hasn't been a lot of experience to prepare them, and there's a lack of maturity for a lot of young adults. I know that you guys are all very responsible young adults, but not all young adults are. And so there's little anticipatory socialization in how to deal with all the different conflicts and stresses and things that come with being part of a family and being the head of a family and having children. Limited learning occurs during the pregnancy process. We often don't find out that we're pregnant until some weeks or even months after the pregnancy is initiated. And so once we find out that we're going to have a child, we may try to start getting ready for being a father or a mother. But that's a fairly short period of time, and there's other things taking up a lot of our time, a lot of the hours in our day. And so we just don't get to do a whole lot to try to prepare for being a parent. We're focused on getting the nursery painted and the crib put together and getting plenty of diapers and getting all those kinds of things. We're often overwhelmed by those challenges, and we can't really think about what is a good parent, what kind of parent do I want to be, how do I want to raise my child, what kind of discipline will I use, how will I co-parent with my husband or wife. That can be a pretty abrupt transition to parenthood, and there certainly is a lack of clear and helpful guidelines for what it means to be a successful parent. I've got some friends who have had great experiences raising their children, but I really don't know exactly what they've done to be so successful as parents. I certainly believe that as a parent, it's important to provide nurturing and love and acceptance, but there's also an importance for discipline. I don't believe that physical punishment is particularly effective in most cases. Certainly, when we think about corporal punishment of spanking or paddling a child who has broken some of our rules, that doesn't seem to be particularly effective, and in actuality can actually lead to a repeating of a cycle of violence with subsequent generations. And psychologists will say that physical punishment is just not a good idea. But you have to try to maintain control of your children in some way. And so the question is, how do you do that? If you're overly permissive, then the children don't learn that the rules are the rules and we all have to play by them. And so that can be a bad thing. But if you're overly rigid and protective, then the child may want to rebel against those rules. So there are a number of books that have been written on child rearing, including books on what they call the strong-willed child. And so it's not a bad idea to familiarize yourself with early childhood development theories and to become somewhat cognizant of, how kids learn and what messages they receive when they see different things with their parents. But that can be very helpful, but a lot of us don't avail ourselves of that opportunity. We see that about 10% of all children actually live with a grandparent. I didn't live with either of my mother's mother came to live with us when she got very ill, and she spent about the last 8 or 9 years of her life living with us. But by then I was in high school, and she was visually impaired at that point. She had lost her eyesight due to cataracts and diabetes, and so my relationship with her was really influenced by those experiences quite a bit. And so she didn't have a real formative impact on me by living with us when I was a child, but I was close to both of my grandmothers. Unfortunately, both my grandfathers passed away before I was born, and so I never had the experience of getting to know them and forming a bond with them, and I always kind of felt like I missed out on Grandpa, and so I actually kind of had a couple of surrogate grandpas that I latched on to that would take me fishing and hunting and things like that. Adoption refers to the transfer of legal rights, responsibilities, and privileges of parenthood to a new legal parent or parents. Every year, about 110,000 children are adopted in this country. Not all in this country. Some of them come from other countries because we know that the adoption process is a long, expensive process if you're adopting children that are here in the United States, but sometimes it can be cheaper to go overseas, and there's less red tape to go overseas and adopt children from orphanages in other countries. But that certainly can be an issue. The functionalist perspective points out that the government does have a strong interest in encouraging these adoptions, because if these children grow up in foster homes and orphanages and other living arrangements, the federal government has to provide assistance for the care of those children. When those children become adopted by a forever family, then the government no longer has the same kind of financial responsibility. So, and also, when these kids grow up in a loving, nurturing environment, rather than in a foster home, the hope is that they're going to be better adjusted and be better citizens and have more productive lives. Okay. The interactionist perspective says that adoption may require the child to learn some new behaviors in their new home and their new family environment, and they may have to adjust to some new rules and parental approaches to child care and child rearing. So there can be some adjustment there, but that doesn't mean that the child can't have a happy childhood and grow up and be a very high functioning adult. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about dual income families. We've been kind of talking a little bit about around that topic for a while. So let's talk about dual income families. We see that among couples with children under the age of 18, 93% of the men and 71% of the women were in the labor force in 2016. So we see that a large number of intact families have both mom and dad in the labor force, contributing to the economic well-being of the family. The rise in the number of dual income families is largely due to a number of factors, such as the economic need. It's very difficult to become middle class or to stay in the middle class unless you've got two incomes in the family. We've seen wage stagnation over the last 30 years or so, unfortunately. And inflation has been rising faster than wages have been rising, and that has made it more difficult for families to achieve and remain at middle class status. There's also the desire from both members to pursue careers. Women who were stay-at-home moms may have experienced that as a very fulfilling experience, but they might have also yearned for something more. And today, young women are being encouraged to pursue those interests. And so if they have a career interest, they may be just as invested in their careers as their spouses are. Okay. And we've also seen an increase in what are called commuter marriages, where the couple lives apart and they get together on weekends and holidays and vacation and all of that. There's been an increase in the number of commuter marriages, which can be very rewarding, but they can be very strained relationships because of the time apart, depending on the couple. Okay. Single parent families you only have one parent that's responsible to care for the child and to supervise and protect and do all of the things that family does. And that can be problematic. We see that in 2016, a single parent headed 21% of white families with children, 30% of Hispanic families, and 59% of black families in the United States. So single parent households have become very common, particularly among African American families. And while that's not a cause of concern, if the family's financially well off, it is a very serious concern when the family is struggling financially. In recent decades, the stigma that's attached to being an unwed mother has really diminished significantly. So we don't really stigmatize single parents to the extent that we did in the past. Today, I think because of divorce and people choosing to remain single and things of that nature, single parent households are significantly more common, and therefore the stigma has kind of diminished a little bit. But life in a single parent household can be extremely stressful, particularly if your children are reaching adolescence and they're starting to kind of rebel a little against parental authority and maybe against all authority, and they're trying to establish themselves as young adults. That can be a very tumultuous time, and not having two parents in the household can be stressful. My mom did not, discipline me a whole lot, but there were times when she had to discipline me, and in cases where the behavior was more egregious and violated her expectations a little bit more. Sometimes she would just say, "Do you want me to have a conversation with your father when he gets home?" And usually that was enough for me to say, "No, I'm good. I'll straighten up and play by the rules because I don't want to have that conversation with my dad." And even though I think my dad is really probably a big softy, back then he was a very scary guy. And so, the threat of my father definitely was enough to get me in line. So maybe you're threatening your child with their mother. Well, you want me to tell your mother how you behave when she gets home? And that may not carry exactly the same impact, but being able to trade off, being able to support each other and present a united front against a child who is rebelling against authority, that can be helpful. Having someone to talk to about how frustrating it is can be helpful. But when you've got a single parent there, they're dealing with all of that stress and frustration by themselves. And so that can certainly be overwhelming. Okay. And as I said earlier, because of all the divorce and remarriage, we have step families, blended families. You may have watched the movie Blended. I know it's a comedy and it's silly, but some of the conflicts that they addressed in that movie are somewhat similar to the conflicts that actual blended families do have to deal with. And we see that children may not necessarily be better off in a blended family than they were as part of a single parent household. In some cases, for example, we see that children who are raised in families with stepmothers are less likely to have health care, education, and money being spent on their food. So sometimes having a stepmother is not necessarily a great thing. And of course, we know that having a stepfather is not always a great thing either. Let me tell you something, guys. If you've been lucky enough to have a step parent that has been a good step parent, thank them today, because it is a very difficult job and it's sometimes thankless. It's very hard to parent someone else's children. Even if you get into that relationship when the children are fairly young, they know you're not their actual biological parent, and they will at some point probably test you in regards to, you're not my dad. You can't tell me what to do, what to think, what to say. So step parenting is really kind of a thankless job, and it doesn't pay nearly enough. I'm teasing, but seriously, it is extremely difficult to be a good step parent. And I was a step parent to two daughters, and I had my failures and I had my successes, and unfortunately, I was not always able to make the right decision or a good decision, but I always tried to step parent with love in my heart and tried to do the thing that was in the best interest of the children and the family. But even then, it can be a challenge. Okay. Divorce can occur when tension exists between our commitments to marriage and self-expression and personal growth. We want to grow into this person that we can be, and we don't really want to have to sacrifice who we are as individuals just because we're married. Males have really benefited from that more than females. I think the expectation of women to comply and to subvert their own personal goals for the family. The pressures have really been there in the past, and it's very hard a lot of times for young women to decide between career and family. So let's say that you've got a dual career family and you are committed to egalitarian structure of decision making, and you're both at work, your husband and you are both at work, and the child gets sick and you get a phone call from the school saying you have to come pick up your child at 9:15 in the morning. The child's vomiting, running a fever. Who's going to go? Are you going to go? If you're the mother, are you going to go? Or are you going to expect the husband? Or are you going to take turns? Okay. And if you have to leave your child at home sick, are you going to feel guilty and worry about them all day when you're at work thinking, I should be home with my child? I've got a sick kid at home. And if the child is young enough, you can't leave them at home. You have to find somebody who can watch over them and take care of them, make sure that they're okay. So those competing goals of family and career goals and all of that, it can be gut wrenching when you have to decide, am I going to miss this meeting today that I need to? I've been working on this presentation for a month, and now my child is sick. Am I going to let somebody else do the presentation that they haven't? Maybe they're not very familiar with it, and go home and take care of my child? Or am I going to be up there giving that presentation, and in the back of my mind, I'm thinking constantly about my sick kid? It can be a real challenge. And those tensions can lead to stress within the marriage and can undermine that relationship. Okay. So let's talk about some of the statistical trends in divorce. I've already talked a little bit about the fact that divorce rates went up tremendously, explosively, once we passed legislation allowing no-fault divorces. And so We commonly hear that, well, one marriage in two is going to end in divorce. We assume that about 50% of marriages end in divorce. It's actually not quite that bad. It's actually about 44% of marriages end in divorce. We see that. Of course, what time frame are we measuring this in? Is it a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 40-year? We can look at these reports about divorce in different ways, but that report that 1 out of every 2 marriages ends in divorce comes from the number of divorces in a year compared to the number of marriages in the same year. And that's really not fair, right? Because those people who are getting divorced were married some years ago. And so we're looking at the marriages that occur this year versus the divorces that occur this year. And that's not really an accurate measurement of how many marriages are going to end in divorce. So we see that 70% of marriages that began in the 1990s were still together as of late 2014. So that presents a little bit different picture, doesn't it? And those who married between 2000 and 2010 have a stronger tendency to stay together. I think people are waiting longer. And that's going to lead to them making better decisions, hopefully. So the divorce rate has declined since the late 1980s in many countries, including the United States. The divorce rate is on the decline, but the marriage rate is also on the decline. Fewer people are choosing to get married. And yet, we know that 95% of American men and women will get married at least once in their lifetime. Okay, so lots of confusing stats, but look, we have to look at each one in the context in which the data is gathered and analyzed. Okay. So if you look at figure 12-4, trends in marriage and divorce in the United States, 1920 to 2014, you will see that the marriage and divorce rates have been kind of similar to each other. Those two lines across there are somewhat similar. Now, people are getting married at much higher numbers because you can't get divorced unless you've been married, right? And not everybody who gets married does get divorced. So the lines have a gap between them. The lines have come closer together in recent decades, but there has been a little bit of a decline in the divorce rate since the late 1980s to present day. So there's some very interesting trends there, and we see that both the marriage and divorce rate have declined since 1979. 1979. So people are getting married at a lower rate, and they're getting divorced at a lower rate as well. 57% of all divorced people have remarried. Having been divorced and remarried and divorced again, I'm not anxious to get married again. I'm not saying that I won't. I do definitely believe in the institution of marriage, but I'm not going to have more children, and so it doesn't seem necessary for me to get married again. Most divorced people will get remarried, 57%. As of the research that was done here. And we see that women are less likely to remarry than men because of child custody issues. And so, having custody of the child can make it less appealing, make a woman less appealing as a desirable marriage partner simply because somebody doesn't want to be a stepdad. It can be, they know that it can be a stressful and tough time. So what are some of the factors that are associated with greater rates of divorce in this country? I've already mentioned the no-fault divorce laws, or more liberal divorce laws, as the book puts it. There are more practical options in some of our newly formed families. So, the fact that people can get divorced and remarry, that possibility, may encourage people to go ahead and get divorced and look for somebody that they think will help them achieve happiness in their home life. a general increase in family incomes. If you're not making much money and divorce is going to cost you a lot of money as a father in child support and alimony for those states that have alimony, that can really encourage families to stick it out and stay together in spite of the conflict within the family because of economic hardships that might be even scarier than staying together and fighting. Okay, and then greater opportunities for women mean that they are somewhat less dependent on their husbands, and therefore they may choose to divorce because they've got economic opportunities. They're not dependent upon that man that's not treating them well or not making them happy, and so they can pursue happiness in their personal relationships by ending one and perhaps starting a new relationship. Okay, so as I said earlier, there was a lot of concern about children of divorce, and are they gonna be unruly and unmanageable in schools, and then not get good educations, and then not be very adapted to the workplace and things of that nature. We've done a study, a national study that tracked 6,332 children before and after the divorces, and we see that their behavior did not suffer appreciably. Other studies have shown that there's greater unhappiness among kids who live with fighting, conflict-ridden parents than among those whose parents are divorced. And, there aren't a whole lot of advantages to divorce, but when a kid gets 2 birthday parties and 2 Christmases, it's not all bad. Yes, divorce is awful on everybody involved, but there are some things that the child might appreciate. Okay, although they certainly probably are really sad to see their parents divorce, they may be glad that the conflict is ending and the nonstop fighting has ended. Okay, about 62% of child support of court-ordered child support is paid. So that means that about 38% of court-ordered child support does not get paid. You've got the whole thing. We've had this discussion about deadbeat dads not paying their child support. Child support can be pretty onerous, but it certainly is necessary. And as a father who had a child, I certainly wanted to pay my child support and to help provide for the needs of my daughter. I also, welcomed her to come and live with me, and she did a couple of times over the course of her adolescence. I was certainly glad to provide a home and food, and to be able to have that bond with my daughter. That was more damaging to me than the actual divorce was. I was really the child care giver for my daughter to a large extent because my wife was an RN and she worked a lot of night shifts. So I was with my daughter and stepdaughters a lot, and losing that daily interaction with my daughter was devastating to me. So, I understand that dads are negatively impacted by divorce as well when they don't get custody and they miss their children. It was really awful. Okay, the proportion of custodial mothers in poverty is almost 32%, 31.8%, which is about twice as many as custodial fathers who are in poverty. So it's not uncommon for single female-headed households to be below the poverty line. We see that about 31.8% of them are below the poverty line, and that's about twice as many as for fathers who are custodial. Okay. In terms of lesbian and gay relationships, some lesbians and gay men live alone, but they also may live with roommates or others in long-term monogamous relationships. The perception that we have of gay couples is that there's a lot of promiscuity and multiple relationships with multiple partners and all of that, but certainly there is a percentage of gay couples, lesbian couples who are in long-term committed relationships, even though they may choose not to get married. They may be in committed relationships. Today, with same-sex marriage being the law of the land, more of them are choosing to marry, but some are choosing, to remain committed to each other but not get married as well. Of course, that occurred in 2015. The same-sex marriage made the law of the land by the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, same-sex divorce is complicated by jurisdictional issues. Sometimes couples have to travel back to the state in which they got married in order to get divorced, and that can be quite stressful. And queer theorists point out that there's a lack of high quality research on LGBT households, and so certainly we need to be doing more research into the lives of same-sex couples and their children to see, how well are those families functioning, and what can we learn about those families that might be applicable to opposite-sex couples. There's been a lot of diversity in lifestyles. Marriage has lost some of its social significance as a rite of passage, and what we mean by that is there was a time when, if you wanted to be an adult, you got married. You graduate high school, now you're almost an adult. If you want to be fully accepted by society as an adult, get married. Well, that's a lot less common today. People today are probably not getting married just to, graduate into adulthood. And that's probably why we're seeing marriage being delayed. One of the reasons why we're seeing marriage being delayed. Also, just the overall decline in the marriage rate due to people saying, I don't have to be married to be in a committed relationship or to be happy. I can be an independent person and stand on my own 2 feet and date for recreation, or to form a committed relationship without marriage, or even to live together with someone without marriage. And so there are more partnerships that are being formed without marriage, and we call that cohabitation. Which is defined as the practice of living together as male-female couples without marrying. But I think today we have to look at cohabitating same-sex couples as well as opposite-sex couples. About half of currently married couples in the United States live together before marriage. That doesn't necessarily guarantee that their marriage is going to be more successful than those couples who did not live together prior to getting married. We see that about 40% of couples' households had children under the age of 18, and cohabitation is much more common in Europe even than here in the United States. So it's likely that this increase in cohabitation without marriage is likely to continue. In terms of remaining single, we see that fewer than 4% of women and men in the United States are likely to remain single throughout their lives. But there are some reasons why people may decide not to get married. They don't want to limit their sexual intimacy to one person, perhaps. They may also not want to be highly dependent on another human being, and so they choose not to get married. They may have a greater ability to follow their values of individuality and self-fulfillment, be more goal-oriented in terms of career and things of that nature. And I can tell you this, guys, even though I definitely am a proponent of marriage and definitely a proponent of family, if you want to, and children, if you want to travel the world and have exotic vacations in locales all around the globe, that probably is going to be complicated and made much more difficult if you have children. Because as I said earlier, research suggests that it costs somewhere around $280,000 to raise a child from infancy to adulthood, and that doesn't include the cost of college. But over $250,000. Can you take a few trips on $250,000? Absolutely. So it is more difficult. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult to be able to take exotic vacations to other lands and things of that nature if you have children, unless you're, very well off financially. If you're in the upper middle class or the upper class, that is less of a concern. But for the typical lower middle class, working class, and many upper middle class families, it becomes really hard to do a lot of things if you're paying for 2 or 3 children as well. Just buy plane tickets for a family of 5, and you'll see very quickly. And then we think about lodging and food and everything. Travel becomes very, very difficult. Okay. As I said, there's also a little bit of an increase in the number of couples who are choosing to not have children. Somewhere between 16 to 22% of women will complete their childbearing years without having had a child. That's up from about 9 to 10% in 1980. So more couples are choosing not to have children. And some of these couples prefer to see themselves as child free rather than childless, because childless makes it sound like you're missing something. Child free, doesn't that sound, ooh, I'm child free? Doesn't that sound great? If you're a parent, you know that sometimes it feels really good to be able to say, hey, I'm child free, even if it's just for a weekend. Okay. I love my daughter, but there were certainly times when she would go to visit her mother and I'd think, oh, I've got a weekend to myself. I can just do nothing. I can absolutely do nothing, and nobody's going to expect me to feed them or take them here, drive them there, entertain them. So, some couples are choosing to see themselves as child-free rather than childless. Okay. As I said, having children is certainly expensive, about $280,000 per child. And there are certainly concerns about workplace practices regarding child care. Am I working in an environment where they are aware that I have a child and they're okay with me having to take off from time to time because I have a sick child? And is that going to negatively impact my career as I'm trying to climb the corporate ladder and things of that nature? All of that can weigh on people. And if you choose not to have children, then it doesn't weigh so much. The last thing that I want to talk about very briefly is family leave. Here in the United States, we have the Family Medical Leave Act, which will allow mothers to have some time after childbirth unpaid, unfortunately. We are way behind the rest of the industrialized world in terms of providing paid leave to family members when there's some kind of medical issue or a new child coming into the world. If you'll look at figure 12-5, that's paid maternity leave in selected countries. And so there we are in the middle in the gray, the United States, with 0 weeks of federally mandated paid maternal leave. And then you see that there are other countries that are pretty generous in regards to their laws regarding medical leave. And so, for example, we see that the Philippines has about 9 weeks of paid leave for moms who've given birth. Uruguay, 12 weeks, all the way up to 26 weeks. Now, if I'm not incorrect, 26 weeks is about half of a year, so about 6 months of paid leave in Poland to new mothers. Okay, paid leave to new mothers. Okay, so there we are with a big zero, and we see that other countries are doing a great deal more to make sure that moms can stay home with their new babies for a period of time and bond and care for them and nurture them and form that connection with their newborn child. Now, things are even worse when we start talking about paid paternity leave. In other words, the dad is able to take some time off. Well, if we don't give any time to mothers, we're probably not going to give any time to dads either, right? So there we are right there in the 0 weeks category. And we see that different countries provide for more leave. Here in this case, we see that Indonesia, it's only 2 days, but it's paid time off, 2 days for dad to stay at home with his wife and child and to spend time with them and make sure that mom's okay, particularly if she's had a rough delivery or something, a C-section or something like that, all the way up to Portugal, which gives almost 3 weeks. Actually, I guess that's 4 work weeks if they're working 5 days a week. If they work 4 days a week, that might be 5 weeks of time for dad to stay home with newborn baby and mom and help take care of the baby and get acclimated to this new human being in the household. So I think we really ought to look at our policies in this regard. Some companies voluntarily provide these paid leave for their employees, but because it's not federally mandated, most companies do not. and it's becoming less and less common today as businesses seem to become less loyal to their employees, just as employees become less loyal to their place of employment. We're seeing fringe benefits and insurance and all of that kind of stuff diminish in quality, and so it's unlikely